So Europe seems to have a problem, I think. So what are we going to do about this competitiveness issue? What is the data telling us? I think I might start with you, Katerina. If you can set the scene, what's going on in Europe? What's frustrating the industry? Over to you.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here. So if I can summarize shortly to set the scene, and you already mentioned a bit that the share of clinical trial in Europe is falling. So what we did in our discussion with our companies and members, we observed for a longer time already there are some challenges that there is increased complexity, that there are prolonged timelines. So we said, let's have a look at what the numbers tell us. What are the trends? So more than after the concrete numbers, we're after the trend. So we had a look at the number of clinical trials, actually for all clinical trials, the non-commercial, commercial, and what is the share, and compared it to other regions. So we looked for the past 5 and even 10 years. So what we've seen is if for the past decade that, 10 years ago, more than a half of clinical trials were still in the North America, in the European region. We've seen that shift during that last decade to Asia, especially China. So, and that if the US, the number stayed more or less the same, that was mostly on the account of European trials. When we had a closer look, we noticed is that we've seen the drop for most of the therapeutic areas, also for oncology, even though the oncology stays the biggest share, but still we've seen the drop there. We had a look at all member states. Of course, there are differences, but in the vast majority of member states, we've seen decreased numbers. The same goes when it comes to different phases, even to pediatric clinical trials, and across sponsors, and especially when it comes to advanced therapy, medicinal products, we've seen a big fall in phase 1 trials. So this somehow indicated we actually have not a specific therapeutic area or a sponsor-specific challenge, but it's actually ecosystem challenge, a systemic issue that we need to address. And we all know that when it comes to clinical trials, you need to have involved so many different stakeholders, and it's really a joint effort. So I'll leave it there.
It's really interesting that you mentioned the drop in phase 1 trials, which is really worrying, is that is the pipeline. You're building your pipeline, aren't you? Let's just go a little bit more, unpack what you said. So what is China doing that's so great? What's their secret sauce?
So what we've seen is that they actually recognize the value of clinical trials. So there was really intense strategic investment in infrastructure, in the policy, in favorable regulatory environment. And then at the same time, we also need to recognize that, it's a big country. You have a big pool of patients there. And when it comes to Europe, we have so many strengths, but we also have fragmentation, national specific, something we need to address.
And so FPR, you obviously commissioned this very interesting report last year, which I read page from the beginning to end. And so I noticed in there that you mentioned Spain. You call out Spain. You're saying they're doing really good things. Can you let us know, what did Spain do that is so good?
Yeah, so we did take actually 2 examples, Spain and Denmark, and there are, just the truth be told, there are more good examples in Europe, so it's not all bad. But for every country, especially also for Spain, what we notice is that they, as already said, they recognize the value of the clinical trials, and they actually started proactively, strategically, in a coordinated manner, investing into where they see the gap, into infrastructure. They're having multi-stakeholders continuously discussing and really following up and monitoring what is happening in their environment. And we see the same in Denmark, in Belgium, and also in other countries, recognizing you cannot really fix 1 or 2 things, and it cannot be driven only by one person or industry or only, academia. It needs to be joint effort. And this is what we see is actually working in practice.
So I'm hearing systemic and I'm hearing infrastructure.
Yeah.
So we're very lucky here to have Veronica with us, who works at the Department of Health, and you have this big bird's eye view of everything. So tell us what's happening in Slovakia with clinical trials. I hear that things are not going well.
No.
What's driving that? Tell us all about it.
So as was already mentioned, that we do see the drop of clinical trials across the EU states. It's been reported it's about 25 to 30%, which is quite a staggering number. We do see the same trend in Slovakia. The number of clinical trials has dropped 15% in the past 10 years. And the number of Slovak patients that are participating in clinical tests has dropped 50%, which is quite a lot. This drop is around 3 to 5% annually. So again, that's quite a tempo. And on the other hand, though, we also see a 30% decline in investment in clinical trials.
And is that from industry or from the government?
From the government.
Okay.
The government.
What's driving that, do you think?
Hard to say. Probably, let's be quite open, a lack of interest. Maybe there isn't quite a full realization of how important clinical trials actually are. Because what they offer, they offer innovative treatment at no cost, pretty much, for the patients. And but we've observing quite a steady decline. But there is also a very little investment in healthcare focused research and development. Slovakia currently invests only 0.007%, so which is quite a small amount.
And I hear also that Slovakia, before perhaps the clinical trials regulation, the latest update of it, you guys were quite speedy in terms of your trials, but then things slowed down. Do you want to tell us what's happening there? What's slowing things down?
So the processes were actually quite speedy. We were one of the countries that was one of the fastest to do the clinical trials and to go through the whole process. Now the new European regulations is actually something that's slowing things down, because we have this, we have a set of rules that sort of, is an overarching set of rules from the EU, and then there are more regulations on the country level. One of the things that's problematic is that the ethics committee is quite slow. They sometimes send, their sort of feedback is down to the level of grammatical mistakes, which is not something you want to focus on too much. As I said, the investment is quite low, so that is a problem. And another issue is that the ecosystem is quite fragmented. So the sponsors have to negotiate contracts with each hospital separately, rather than there being some umbrella organization that could just deal with the negotiations.
For sponsors, I guess.
And that is very time consuming. It's money consuming. Mm-hmm. So it's quite, so Slovakia is slowly becoming sort of like, the rest of the world, rather than, offering what we can offer.
Thank you for that insight. So obviously you touched on this idea that clinical trials, and I think other sessions also mentioned this, that clinical trials are not just trying to get a product approved at the end of the process, it's about care as well. So I'm going to bring in Elisabetta here. Tell us what's your experience of what you've seen in Europe in terms of the competitiveness of the clinical trial ecosystem, and what does that actually mean to patients then?
Yeah. First, we are very disappointed to see that the number of clinical trials in oncology are going down in Europe. This is very worrisome. There is a trend of declining number of clinical trials. Let's say the share of Europe's clinical trials is going down in general, but in the case of oncology, this is even more the case. So first, very worrisome development, a trend which at the end of the day is impacting very negatively on patients. Because of course, we are talking of patients very often who have exhausted all the treatment options available to them, and therefore the last hope, the last possibility is to be enrolled into a clinical trial. So if the clinical trial is not being conducted in Europe, basically we are depriving these patients from a potentially life-saving innovative treatment. The second problem with the decline of clinical trials in Europe is that often the place where clinical trials are conducted can also give us a good indication of where the marketing authorization will be sought first. So if clinical trials are not conducted in Europe, this could mean that a therapy could receive marketing authorization from the European Medicines Agency or the MHRA, the UK regulator, at a later stage, or even that perhaps it will not receive any marketing authorization in Europe at all. So this is, again, a big problem for patients in terms of delayed access to potentially life-saving life-saving innovative therapies or not having that access at all in the future. Of course, there is also an element of competitiveness linked to clinical trials, because an environment which is supportive for clinical trials is also, of course, leading to innovation happening in Europe. And if we don't conduct the clinical trials in Europe, we may, of course, not see this innovation happening
So the impacts are not just patients, it's wider economy, it's our healthcare system.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So patient first and foremost, but there is much more than that. It's really basically having a Europe which is either attractive or not for innovation.
Thank you for that, Elisabetta. Really good words there on that. And then obviously our children are affected by this in Europe. And already pediatric research is, one of those Cinderella services, always an afterthought. So to you, Maya, what does a clinical trial mean to childhood cancer? And also tell us about, crossing borders and getting treatment in other countries, because your country is not doing a clinical trial in a particular childhood cancer. What are the challenges there? I'd love to hear all about that.
Thank you very much. I think the first challenge we are facing is that childhood cancer is a rare disease. So we have small numbers. We don't have many patients. So since the 1960s, when the first treatments for leukemia started, it has always been a collaboration. And so pediatric oncology is very collaborating and has lived through trials. If we can cure today like 80% of children with childhood cancer, it's only because we have always been and living through clinical trials who have allowed this progress and improvement and the results. Now, what we are facing now is that when you have a high cure rate, you have to cure the other ones. We have trials that gain in complexity. We have many arms. We have treatment adaptations to many biological information and knowledge that we have achieved. And on the other hand, we have to improve treatments of those who will be cured in terms of reduction of toxicity, innovative treatments, targeted treatments to be more effective and less toxic. And this brings me to the second point, that what we are really in need is to have an acceleration in innovation. And this, again, is for a disease that is rare. To have the same level of innovation is difficult. And for this, in pediatric oncology, to have really the recognition of a comprehensive childhood cancers infrastructure that has to be implemented into the healthcare system is very important. And also, in addition, to acknowledge that treatments cannot be all the treatments given everywhere, that we need also to cross borders and to facilitate to families and patients to cross borders for some treatments.
So cross-border is hugely important. It's not a topic we often talk about. So we talked about competitiveness. I'd like to kind of shift the conversation slightly and look at kind of the future of design of clinical trials. And there's a lot of talk about pragmatic trials. What does that mean? And we have Niels here, who is an expert on this. And so, Niels, I'd love to ask you, first of all, what is a pragmatic trial? Okay, I'm sure some people know, but maybe some people don't. And also, what about the quality side of that? Because some of the purists may say, you know what, I want my pure, eligibility criteria. How do you measure quality with these type of trials? So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I do agree that the number of patients going into clinical trials have decreased also in Sweden, and big pharma have left for many of the pivotal trials. They focus on Denmark, etc. Talking about pragmatic trials, they are quite scarce to this point in oncology. There are a few reported in that what we call registry-based randomized clinical trials. They have been quite successful in cardiology, and they're basically based on the concept that you build up a high-quality patient registry. They don't have to be extensive, but you need to have, let's say, solid high-quality data on the patient. And then, of course, when you reach a situation where you have true uncertainty if you're going to pick, let's say, treatment A or B, and there is really no guidance within what's been approved by regulatory authorities, I mean, that's a situation where you can motivate that you can do a randomization. Of course, you need the informed consent from the patient, but you don't need to set up a very complex infrastructure around this procedure. So you basically have a true uncertainty. You have, it could be A versus B, or it could be a sequence of treatments that you want to explore. And at that point, if you got acceptance from the patient and consent, you can randomize and start with this sort of pragmatic approach, treating patients in the same order as you treat them in clinical practice.
Yeah, so you're basically taking patients with multi-morbidities, older patients possibly, patients that reflect our communities that we're dealing with as healthcare professionals. But then at the end of it all, because there's no strict protocol, anything goes maybe, how do we prove there's evidence at the end of the day? What quality criteria, or is there any guidance out there to help us?
I think it totally depends on the quality of the registry that you have the patients in. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about real-world data, and I mean, we've been working in this, trying to explore what real-world data really consists of for the 20-25 last years. And I guess it's quite a mixed bag what is called real-world data. If actually we look in critically, the real-world data is a mixture of things. If we look, Scott Ramsey had a report in JCO a couple of years ago showing that the submissions to JCO, only 5% of the real-world data publications were accepted, and similar experience has been from Richard Sullivan and I believe Jana Boyle also in Europe. So I think
the establishment is not convinced yet.
No, I think it's to do registry-based randomized trials is a better option, because we cannot really define what real-world data is, and thereby not having real-world evidence. So I think it's a way to improve quality on clinical effectiveness, which is what we're really looking for, what is happening to patients.
Brilliant. I might bring in Maya and Elisabetta briefly. What are your views on pragmatic trials? What does that mean for patients? Do you have any thoughts on this?
First, I would say that whatever can help patients in terms of clinical trials should be done. So if pragmatic clinical trials can help in terms of improving clinical practice, in identifying which treatments are better for patients, of course, they should be encouraged and supported. I would also like to mention the importance of decentralized trials, to try to involve more clinical centers into clinical trials, because very often what we see is that clinical trials are conducted in comprehensive cancer centers, where there is the infrastructure, where there is the team, where there is everything ready somewhat for the conduct of the clinical trials. But of course, often patients do not necessarily live close to a comprehensive cancer center. They may live in a rural area, in the countryside. So how can we develop a network of hospitals, of medical centers, somewhat connected with a comprehensive cancer center, so that they can also have access, can participate in these.
No, I like this idea of the cancer.
I think it's something which is really very important and would help hugely in terms of making participation into clinical trials more equitable, more open to a broader patient population.
Thank you for that, Elisabetta. Maya, do you have anything to add about that? Because for childhood cancer, This must be hugely important, especially if it's rare cancers.
Yes, I think we have always had the tradition of randomized trials to prove efficacy in order to have also the approval and then also the reimbursement, which is a problem in many places. So, and what is interesting is that patient advocates are convinced of the benefit of randomized trials. Now, as it has been pointed out, sometimes real-world data is a reality. They contribute in increasing knowledge, information in some, let's say, tolerance, side effects, also the possibility to administrate treatments. But we really also in a RAP setting always try to get evidence through randomized trials. And I must say that it is very well accepted when the oncologist is convinced that this is the way to go. Randomization and these prospective trials are really what we can implement in most of the situations.
Thank you for that. Now we're going to talk about funding, I hope, and incentives as well to change this competitive network, so to speak. And so FPR obviously is looking into this quite a bit. So, I mean, what incentives does the industry need, do you think? Do we need any extra incentives? Or because we have European Medicines Agency does PRIME, there's do we need a more upstream government funding? Tell us what you think needs to happen next.
The response might surprise you, right?
Okay.
I think whenever we have a discussion the first response is we need to fix timelines. It's taking too long. So, and we know, right, time is money. But whenever you as a global firm, Europe is one of the key markets, so it's not going away. But when you look for where to go to, you will always look for where is less complexity, where you can set up trials the easiest, the fastest. And of course, the quality of data, we know it's here. We have the expertise, the experts, and the networks in Europe, but it's taking 3 times as long as in US or in China. And this is not acceptable. What are the incentives? It's pretty much to fix the ecosystem. I think that would be the easiest answer. So go away from the complexities and fix the timelines.
So patient recruitment is an important topic. I mean, how can we speed that up? I mean, what does the industry like? I mean, where have you seen, like in Spain, what are they doing that is so good, for instance?
And again, maybe it will surprise you. Nothing fancy. It starts with raising awareness and embedding the clinical research more into the medical care. What is also important, of course, the infrastructure, the tools that the sites have the right infrastructure. But another element we're looking into, I think it was already briefly mentioned, is that cross-border access to clinical trials. We cannot have trials for every trial in every country. That will never happen. One is about the networks, but the other element is that patients can go and can go to a trial that is not in their home country because it's simply not existing. We know it's possible, it's not forbidden, but there is nothing to facilitate that. It takes, again, ages and admin, and it's often on cost of patients.
Excellent. And infrastructure, let's come to Slovakia then. So patient recruitment times, I mean, how fast you get patients into a trial. Also, the idea of decentralized trials is really important because the patient convenience, if you have to travel 2 hours to get to a center, can a local place do collect the tests and what have you. So what are your thoughts on that from the Slovakian experience? How can that be speeded up, so to speak? Or changed in model?
So first off, I feel very little awareness about clinical trials and about all of the advantages that they could bring. Of course, the clinicians know of it, but patients, they very often they have no idea how to sort of go about it or how that could be helpful for them. So spreading the awareness would be quite important. I think to have the clinicians and the medical professionals more connected between each other to sort of, be more aware of where these patients are. Of course, we need good data. We need to have information about what patients do we have, what are the clinical data of these patients, because this is what we're currently missing. We have problems with the registry in Slovakia. It was one of the best until 2014, and then it just stopped. And that's a shame, because knowing the pool of the patients, knowing just, as I said, basic clinical data is very crucial, so that we can actually be like, hey, we do have these patients, let's do this. And then the financing, for sure, because if the clinical trial is not happening in the home country or somewhere near, we need to have funds to make sure that the patient gets to where the clinical trial is happening.
Excellent. All right. I think we're going to have probably lots of questions from the audience. But before I go to that, I just want you guys to say one phrase of what's the top solution to Europe's problem, just in a short sentence, and we'll go around. Then I'm going to open it to the floor. So starting with you, Maya, what needs to happen in one sentence to improve the competitiveness of Europe?
For pediatric oncology is the acknowledgement that we have SciUp Europe, which encompasses the clinical trial groups, encompasses also the national pediatric hematology oncology societies.
More than one sentence?
It is a comma.
Okay. Okay.
And this coordinates is there to promote clinical trials and to help to accelerate and organize innovation.
Perfect. Over to you, Elisabetta.
Yes, I would say that probably one issue that we have not discussed yet is the problem of regulation. The regulation is too fragmented in Europe. There is, of course, the clinical trial regulation trying to harmonize, centralize, but there are too many elements of the authorization process still remaining at national level. And additional requirement like GMO requirements for gene therapies, and a lot of products in that space are also in oncology.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned gene therapy.
And also the IVD regulation, the in vitro diagnostic regulation, which is creating huge problems for trials conducted in association with a diagnostic test, basically to identify the patients who would benefit from that treatment.
I'm glad you mentioned the IV. We didn't
fragmentation.
Talk about that.
The word is fragmentation.
Yeah,
Try to resolve that.
And over to you. Can you do a sentence?
Yeah, I will build on what was just said because also relevant points. I think Europe needs to start acting as a region, going away from the member state specific legislation, interpretation, and going away from all these different processes that are not talking to each other. So we need to streamline, harmonize, and act as a region.
And Niels?
There is a big black box in oncology, and that is treatment of incurable patients. We need to put resources into better research, including then pragmatic trials.
Fantastic. And Veronica?
I'd say less red tape, because people will find a way always. So we need to sort of work with that. We need to make the processes more streamlined, easier, more sector friendly, I'd say. Because as I said, people will find a way and they will try to circumnavigate the rules and will try to climb under the red tape. So I think it's best if we just sort of make sure that this doesn't happen, to sort of regulate, but at the same time, give enough space for the clinical trials to actually be effective and to actually happen.
Yes, less regulation. So I think we'll open up the floor to questions and I'll come back again to you. So we have two gentlemen down there. If you could introduce yourself, please. And could we have a mic down there? Thank you. It's coming your way. And then we'll come back to panel discussion. We'll just have a little interlude. Thank you. You got the mic.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rui Medeiros. I work at IPO Port. It's a comprehensive cancer center, and I'm also at the board of SEO, ECHO. And also, I am university professor. I would like to ask, is something I would not be concerned on Europe as a good place to do research on clinical trials. We have to do it because many reasons. Of course, we have to prepare and improve the administrative process, which is in some countries a problem. We have also the off-label system, which is a shortcut to some things. But my question to the panel is on the issue on this. For instance, you were talking on China clinical trials. We know the population out there is different from our population. In the perspective of precision medicine or pharmacogenomics, we know there are some differences on the efficacy and the side effects of some drugs open to the population. So I would like to ask you what your opinion on that is.
Do you want to take that, Katerina?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. It's a really good question. And I will just emphasize, I think there will be always clinical trials in Europe. And I think there are many strengths that Europe can build on. And it's, as I said, right, it's an important market. But when you see there is high potential, also have high expectations. And if you see there are certain things that are done much better elsewhere, then of course you would like to see that also here. I think that's the key message, because Europe has been in lead so much time, and we lost that kind of a leadership in that. So we would like to see that. That doesn't mean, all is bad, but I think we need to fix some things.
So regaining leadership. Yeah. There was a question here. Yes, you've got the mic. Please go ahead, and then you're next.
Thank you. Very insightful. Francesco Ghini from IUST Cancer Hospital in Italy. So I have a couple of comments, and probably is also questions, but it's related to some specific new things that came out. So the first one is that European Medical Agency published the new portal where you can find all the clinical trial in Europe. So the clinical trial information site, something like
CTIS, I think you're referring to. Yes, exactly.
So this is, I think it's great actually, and probably is going to change the way in which also patients can really try to define their own roadmap about care for cancer, but only for cancer. So this is just one point. On the other hand, I'm a communication manager, and you, Elisabetta, mentioned that for sure the regulation in each nation is quite particular also for communication. Actually, it's not so easy to communicate clinical trial opportunities. So this actually brings me to my question, which is this main role of the patients, how could be, I would say, reinforced? How we can put more energy in this role of the patient, and related to that, the part of the reimbursement for their care. So you know that some clinical trial also can have reimbursement for patient actually moving to other countries for maybe for the clinical trials, also to other cities. So could be this a way to do that? Thank you.
Elisabetta, may I take it? Do you want to take it?
Yes, I'm very sensitive to what you mentioned, the role of the patient. I think that we are lucky, maybe we have very strong patient advocates for childhood cancer, which is crucial in developing clinical trials, because they have incredible knowledge and contribute actively in the concept, and they contribute also in the awareness for the importance of clinical trials. You mentioned communication. They help in communicating, in explaining the importance of clinical trials. So I think this partnership, very close partnership between us professionals and patient advocates is a crucial step, bringing it forward and helping also to have reflections on cross-border and how sending patients to other places for some treatments.
Yes, and I mean, the equity in clinical trials is a huge topic, and we've touched on it, but that's important. There was a question here at the front. Oh, Elisabetta, are you going to answer, and then we'll come to the question?
Yes, I wanted to comment quickly on the point as well. If you have ever participated in a clinical trial as a patient, you would also realize that you can give suggestions on how a clinical trial can be improved. So I think that involving patients also at the moment of the design of the clinical trial can be extremely useful in better understanding their perspective. And I think that there is not that much practice. Maybe in some countries there is, but certainly in certain parts of Europe, there is not this culture of associating patients in the design of the clinical trial. And they can give a very, very positive input, which in my view is a bit underestimated.
Thank you for that, Elisabetta. And over to you.
Hi, it is on the equity point, really, and I'm sure we'll talk about it in the next session as well. But if we're struggling with recruitment to trials anyway in Europe, obviously we have a lot of underrepresented populations. And so how, kind of, as clinical trial experts, what advice can you give in how we can recruit more of these marginalized populations to trials? Because certainly we heard some great news yesterday about Black people in America apparently being overrepresented, but that's absolutely not the case in the UK. And so, yeah, advice.
Yeah, great question. How can we diversify? Yes, we got everyone.
Just
Go, everyone.
happy to start. So, because it's a very relevant question. There are many ways to tackle it. Maybe just to highlight that just a couple of months ago, there started a really big public-private partnership project called READY that is actually looking exactly into this. It's, I think, 5 years long project that will look at how to bring and get access to all those that currently don't really get to the clinical. READY. I can put it down. READY. Yeah, it's IHI project, READY. But there are other elements we didn't really discuss, like decentralized trials and other ways of how to approach different patients and actually depending on the needs.
And I would say also health literacy, yeah. Because very often we see that there is an attitude to try to involve in clinical trials those patients who understand the protocol, who understand the way they will have to comply with the clinical trial. And there is a bias there. So clinicians, they may not even propose to a patient they think may not understand what they have to do to participate in a clinical trial. So I think that educating patients who may benefit from clinical trials about what is a clinical trial, what does it mean to participate, the fact that you have to follow certain clear, strict
clinical trial literacy
principles would be extremely useful. In other words, it's also in the hands of patients somewhat to be skilled in a way that they can take part in a clinical trial.
Totally agree with that. And Veronica, you wanted to add something?
Yes, just as I was mentioning, the thing we need is to have information about patients. And I know that in social space, it is becoming sometimes quite a touchy subject to ask someone about their ethnicity or about their ancestry. But in medicine, we know that this can be quite an important information. And I know that, for example, in Slovakia, we do have certain minorities, and we know that there are some issues with their health, but we don't really have data on it because we do not collect the data on ethnicity. So
it's a challenging area, and
it is a very
trust issue as well.
Exactly.
Are there any other questions from the audience? A gentleman at the back there, if you could introduce yourself as well. Thank you.
My name is Nam. I work at Howard University in Washington, D.C. 99% of my patients are Black American. So I have a curious question for the audience. How do you get funding in Europe to conduct clinical trials? Is the funding the same, increasing or decreasing? Because in the US, we're facing challenges with funding. So to recruit patients is very easy, but we don't have, right now, there's some problem with the money. So how do you basically, if you have problem recruiting patients, we can recruit patients for you very easily from all ethnicity.
That's a really good question, the funding. And especially the United States is facing some challenges on healthcare funding, as we see. Who would like to take that one?
I think it is just that it has to be made a priority.
Go for it.
I think it just has to be made a priority because, as I've mentioned, in Slovakia, the funding has also declined, and it's just a fraction of the percentage of the GDP. So I think making it a priority is really what needs to happen. If there isn't that sort of push and that support from the top, then it's never going to happen.
May I go for it?
Maybe if we have active networks, European-wide networks, I speak a little bit in the name of pediatric oncology, but I think it's applicable also to adults, especially as we have also an interest in adult pediatric collaboration. We have these young adults that have pediatric diseases up to 30 years. I think if as a group we have a functioning European-wide network and can with this and achieve sustainability in promoting this collaboration within a network that will reach our largely, we have much more impact to get some central funding, because from the pediatric side, we always have to fight not to be behind too much, because it's a small community compared. So I think this centralization and collaboration must be crucial also to have a European funding for all.
Fantastic answer there. And Niels, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, it's in Sweden has been very slow in implementing comprehensive cancer centers. So it's just been over the last 3-4 years that we established that. And I believe with the establishment of comprehensive cancer centers, it also comes this obligation to prioritize clinical research and clinical trials in a much more, shall we say, there needs to be a stronger focus on that than we had in the previous structure, where it was organized through what we call regional cancer centers. So I think the comprehensive cancer center will be the driver in this process.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's kind of like that lighthouse, isn't it, guiding the whole system and creating awareness. Do we have any other questions in the audience? So there's a gentleman right at the end, if you can spot him up, go for it.
Yeah, hi, Greg Rossi, AstraZeneca. So firstly, I think thanks for the panel for raising these important issues. Europe has absolutely been a centre of clinical trial execution and engagement that's driven a lot of innovation around the world. But I don't think we should be complacent. I think the topic that we just sort of heard about, the competitiveness versus perhaps the US, where there's a greater capacity, for example, industry-based studies because of the changing funding for research over there, is a reality. EMEA has just approved a couple of drugs with China almost only data, MHRA with just China data that they've introduced. And as we look at the challenges of reimbursement and access across Europe, that's not just an attractiveness of, is Europe a place that we're doing trials for, but actually a place that we can do trials in, because the comparators might be different now across the various regions of the world, as South America comes up, as China comes up, as Asia comes up. So I think we should really not be complacent that this is always going to be a place where we're doing trials. And you can see that 22% of clinical trials were done in Europe, and now it's down to 12%. These are data that I think should be a wake-up call. So I think, as Elisabetta and others on the panel have called for, I think we've got to really look at regulation, simplification, integration around diagnostics, around being able to do cell therapy. There's huge value here. The clinical institutions here are deeply expert. I think there are patient needs here. There are clearly patients here that are willing to go on to clinical trials, but we really need to seriously look at the risks we're taking, because in 10 years' time, it's going to be too late, because a lot of that will have moved somewhere else.
Thank you for those wise words. So we've had a great discussion today. We talked about funding. We talked about equity. The thing is, there are always going to be clinical trials in Europe. That's not going to go away. But yeah, you're right. That trend is going down. But we need to try and reverse it, because clinical trials are not just about, getting treatments, about the whole care network. They are kind of like act as a beacon for what goes on else. So this has been a great panel discussion. Thank you so much. Can we give them all a big applause? Thank you so much. And thank you to AstraZeneca for sponsoring today's event. Thank you so much.